The smell of Third Army was not just the sulfur of spent shells or the iron tang of blood in the hedgerows. It was the suffocating, sweet rot of over-ripened orchards mixed with the stinging vapor of high-octane gasoline and the salt of unwashed skin. By August 1944, the breakout from Normandy had turned from a tentative crawl into a frantic, kinetic sprint across the face of France. George S. Patton Jr. sat in the front seat of his modified M20 armored utility car, his high-polished cavalry boots dusted with a fine layer of grit that seemed to permeate everything. He wasn't looking at the horizon for the enemy. He was looking at his watch. He was looking at the fuel gauges. He was looking at the slumped shoulders of the teenage boys driving the deuce-and-a-half trucks. Patton understood something his contemporaries in the high command were slow to digest. The Sherman tank was a mediocre duelist, but it was a magnificent marathon runner. To win, he didn't need the heaviest armor or the biggest gun. He needed to break the psychological tether between a soldier and his need for rest. The myth of the lightning war usually focuses on the clatter of treads and the roar of the radial engines, but the reality was found in the red-rimmed eyes of the mechanics and the trembling hands of the supply drivers. A tank is a temperamental beast. For every hour it spends moving, it demands 3 hours of maintenance. Torsion bars snap, air filters choke on the kicked-up silt of the French plains, and the rubber track pads shred themselves against the abrasive macadam of the Roman-built roads. In the standard manual of arms, a division moves, then it halts to refit. It breathes. Patton refused to let his divisions breathe. He drove them with a manic, almost cruel intensity that bordered on the fanatical. He knew that if he stopped to let his men sleep, the Germans would dig in. If the Germans dug in, the war became a stationary slaughterhouse of artillery and attrition, the very thing he had spent his life loitering in the shadow of World War I trying to avoid. Down in the guts of the 4th Armored Division, the world had shrunk to the size of a periscope lens and the heat of a steel box. Inside a Sherman, the temperature could easily climb 20 degrees higher than the air outside. The crew sat in a cramped, oily darkness, vibrating with the constant, bone-shaking rhythm of the Continental R975 engine. The loader's arms burned from hoisting 75mm rounds into the breech, his movements becoming sluggish and erratic as the 36-hour mark passed without a wink of sleep. They ate cold K rations out of wax cardboard boxes while the tank was still in motion, the grit of the road crunching between their teeth. There was no glory here, only the pervasive, heavy fog of exhaustion that made the brain feel like it was wrapped in wet wool. Men began to hallucinate. A charred telegraph pole in the distance would morph into a lethal 88mm anti-tank gun. A shifting shadow in a copse of trees became a Tiger tank waiting in ambush. Yet, the orders remained the same. Keep the wheels turning. Patton was obsessed with the logistics of momentum. He understood that a truck driver hauling jerry cans of fuel from the Mulberry Harbors at Omaha Beach was just as vital to the kill as the gunner in the lead tank. These drivers, many of them part of the Red Ball Express, were pushed beyond the limits of human endurance. They drove through the night on narrow, blackout-shrouded roads, guided only by the tiny cat's eye slits of their hooded headlights. They fell asleep at the wheel, their trucks careening into ditches or smashing into stone walls, but the column never stopped. They would drag the driver out, shove a fresh man into the seat, and the fuel would continue its journey toward the front. This was the unglamorous, greasy heart of the blitzkrieg. Without that constant force flow of gasoline, the tanks were just expensive lawn ornaments. Patton bullied his staff, he threatened his quartermasters, and he bypassed the careful, methodical planning of Omar Bradley to ensure that the iron stayed hot. The German defenders were bewildered. Their tactical doctrine was built on the idea of the decisive battle, followed by a period of reorganization. They expected the Americans to stop at the Seine, to pause, to build up their mountains of crates and supplies before the next push. Instead, they found Patton's vanguards appearing in their rear echelons before the frontline reports even reached headquarters. German officers, retreating in what they thought was a safe zone, will be sitting down to coffee only to have a 37mm canister round blast through the wall of their requisition villa. The psychological impact of this relentless pursuit was devastating. When a soldier knows his enemy must sleep, he can find a moment of peace to reload and regroup. When he realizes the enemy is coming for him at 2 in the morning and 4 in the morning, and through the dawn mist without fail, his will to resist begins to liquefy. The physical toll on the equipment was staggering. The maintenance crews, the grease monkeys who lived in the shadow of the wreckage, worked in a state of permanent delirium. They would crawl under a tank in the freezing mud of a midnight rainstorm to weld a broken hull or replace a transmission by the dim light of shielded flashlight. Their fingers were permanently stained black with grease, their knuckles raw and bleeding from the cold. They lived on coffee that tasted like battery acid and the sheer adrenaline of the chase. They were the ones who truly understood Patton's gamble. They saw the price of the speed in the pile of burnout engines and the twisted remains of tanks that had simply been run until they died. To Patton, a tank was a disposable tool, a consumable item no different from a rifle bullet. If he lost 100 Shermans to mechanical failure but gained 50 miles of territory, he considered a bargain. By the time the winter of 1944 arrived and the fog settled over the Ardennes, the exhaustion had reached a breaking point. When the Germans launched their desperate counteroffensive in the Battle of the Bulge, the world expected the Third Army to be spent. They had been charging across Europe for months. Surely they were hollowed out. But this was where the conditioning of the sleepless months paid off. While other commanders hesitated, Patton turned his entire army 90 degrees in the middle of a blizzard. It was a feat of logistical gymnastics that shouldn't have been possible. He demanded his men drive through the frozen night, over black ice and through snow drifts that swallowed jeeps whole. The men were beyond tired. They had moved into a state of functional catatonia where the only thing that existed was the bumper of the truck in front of them and the biting sting of the wind. Inside the relief columns heading for Bastogne, the air was thick with the smell of wet wool and the ozone of the radios. The soldiers were no longer the cocky liberators of the summer. They were hollow-eyed wraiths, wrapped in whatever blankets or civilian coats they could scavenge. They didn't talk much. The noise of the war had become a constant, dull roar that they had learned to tune out. They moved because the man behind them was moving, and because the man in the polished boots at the head of the column refused to let the world stop turning. Patton's genius wasn't in the maps or the grand flanking maneuvers. It was in his cold, calculating realization that the human spirit can be stretched much further than any textbook suggests, provided you never give it the chance to snap back into a state of rest. As the Third Army spilled over the Rhine and into the crumbling heart of the Reich, the cost of this pace was written on every face. The victory was total, but it was a victory of the exhausted over the defeated. The tanks were battered, their paints sandblasted away by the grit of 5 countries, their engines rattling with the death throes of 1,000 miles of neglected maintenance. But they had arrived. They had outrun the German collapse. In the end, it wasn't the thickness of the Sherman's armor that had broken the Wehrmacht. It was the fact that the Americans simply never went to bed. They had been driven into a state of permanent forward motion by a man who feared the silence of a halted column more than he feared the fire of the enemy. The war ended not with a final, glorious charge, but with the quiet, heavy thud of thousands of men finally dropping into the dirt and closing their eyes, the sound of the engines finally cutting out, leaving a silence so profound it felt like a weight. The machinery had survived, the territory had been won, but the men who had done the winning would carry the phantom vibration of those moving treads in their bones for the rest of their lives, a permanent reminder of the weeks when sleep was the only luxury they couldn't afford. Would you like me to focus on the specific mechanical failures of the M4 Sherman during the rapid advance across France? Or perhaps analyze the logistical nightmare of the Red Ball Express in more detail?